Hello, class. My name is Mr. Lyon, and I used to teach modern U.S. history, and I was co-teaching it with Miss Check when she started here. So I have experience with this, and so what we're going to try to do is you're going to have your regular live classes. But for at least student 5, I'm going to go through and try to do some like rapid recap, short versions of what would be discussed coming from someone who has experience teaching the course. So we are starting in Unit 5, which you're going to be in before and after Thanksgiving break. It's going to take up basically the rest of November. So, agenda. All right, the objective is students can describe experiences of African Americans post-Civil War. So we're going to do 501, less than equal, 502, different visions, 503, demanding a voice woman during the Progressive Era. We're not going to have the regular interaction you would have in class with exit tickets or drop-ins and all this stuff. All right, so it was not so simple when the Civil War is over as just ending slavery, because you had a million people who had been enslaved suddenly no longer are bound to the land. However, the South's economy is still pretty agricultural, so it's sharecropping. It's an agricultural system in the post-Civil War South in which landless individuals farmed a section of someone else's land. Right? So you rented what you worked on. And the sharecroppers received a portion of the profits from the sale of crops. So previously, the dynamic was you had a slaveholder who was in charge of the plantation, who owned the slaves, who didn't get paid, and the slaveholder held all the profits. Here, we have a situation where most of the landowners are white. And both African Americans and poor whites worked as sharecroppers, but the majority were formerly enslaved people and their descendants. So, for some people, the changing between slavery, sharecropping, was instead of getting paid nothing, you got paid very little. And instead, you couldn't be abused anymore, couldn't be whipped. You still had very hard working hours. Now, part of the reason this works is sharecroppers are forced to buy everything from the landowners. This inflated prices. They would be denied access to the account books. And sharecroppers fell deeper into debt each year. In some ways, it ended up being slavery by another name, because if you are in debt to the landowner and you cannot, the only way to deal with that debt is saying, well, deal with that, you're going to work for me another year. Right? Or them. You can't really freely leave. So we get segregation. Segregation is a social system that stripped African Americans of their basic rights, kept them at the very bottom of society, attempting to separate them from white society, and kept them from voting. So segregation is ultimately about separation, and which people are assigned by race places to go. So water fountain for white people, water fountain for black people, a school for white people, a school for black people. So what comes of this is Jim Crow laws. These are laws passed by Southern state legislatures designed to segregate African Americans from whites. This is not an overnight thing. Immediately after the Civil War, there is Reconstruction. There are American troops in the South. Even after they leave in 1877, it's going to take several decades for all these things to go into a row and to undo the progress that had been done. And earlier on, the federal government was opposing the state's efforts, originally with soldiers, but later with, just general legislation. Till we get a thing called Plessy v. Ferguson. It's a U.S. Supreme Court case that established segregation as legal as long as African Americans had access to their own separate but equal facilities. Specifically here, this has to do with the train car, in which seating on trains was segregated. And you had a man, okay, down by Plessy, and he was mixed race, was not obviously African American just by appearance, right? But they used him as a test case. And here, the new doctrine is separate but equal. It was legal to separate people based on race as long as they were given equal accommodations. How does this work in actual practice? Right? You have a white school, you have a black school. You can take a guess on which school got textbooks that were updated more often. Which school paid their teachers more? So the 15th Amendment says they can't stop black men from voting, just forbidding African American men. That does not stop there from being attempts. So we have literacy and citizenship tests. How this works is that to vote, you need to pass a literacy test, which proves you can have a basic understanding of the English language. This sounds reasonable at first. However, these tests are rigged. They are purposely confusing, and they are pass-fail. So you miss one, holding's done. The other bit is that you would have a grandfather clause. And a grandfather clause was if your grandfather was a citizen and could vote, these tests did not apply to you. So, and the Jim Crow South. African American, the grandfather, they were a slave. Of course, they couldn't vote. A white individual, their grandfather, he was a free man. You vote. So, it's the example of the state of Louisiana. It is a trick test. It's really long. You got a time limit. You missed one. You missed the entire thing. The whole point is to stop people from voting. This was not a good faith test. All right, they have poll taxes. Poll taxes is a tax imposed by many southern states where voters had to pay to cast ballots in local, state, and federal elections. This was designed to keep African Americans from voting. Currently, if you want to go vote, it's free. Right? You time off, whatever, but it's free. It's not cost you anything to vote. So poll taxes, some of them were immediate in that you paid a certain amount of money to be able to vote. Others is if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a poll tax each year. And if you thought that's not worth it, and you went 4 years and he said, I'm not going to vote, and he decided, I want to vote, you go to vote, you got to pay 5 years worth of poll taxes. A lot of these poll taxes were also subject to the grandfather clause, where if your grandfather was a citizen, you may be exempt from them. Still, them being around resulted in both. This is targeted toward African Americans. It does affect poor, rural white people as well. And it allows the people that were the previous slaveholders, the aristocracy, to hold a lot of political power. Okay, lynching. Lynching is an organized mob murder, usually penetrate against African American men. So this is vigilante justice. It is when people take justice into their own hands and they deem someone guilty of a crime, and they kill them. Right? They haven't been given a trial. Right? This is not the death penalty execution. There has not, there hasn't been a system that goes through. Now, often African American men are the ones that are the victims here. Doesn't do introduce terror. African American Southerners, rob them of their humanity. And because the U.S. has certain constitutional protections when it comes to your right to a trial and things there. A lot of times lynching happens when someone's already in jail. They may be actually guilty of the crime. But you would have law enforcement who did not like them that basically looked the other way as people broke into jail. And they would lynch a prisoner who never got their fair day in court. All right, so how African Americans should respond to that? There are different visions from different African American thinkers. Someone like Booker T. Washington. He graduated from Hampton Institute. He founded the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama in 1881. And he gave lectures around the country and established, this is what he called it, the National Negro Business League. So he's trying to help within that society that is already like this to allow for people to have African Americans to have a chance when it comes to education and business. Set up your own institutions. So he believed schooling for African Americans should focus on self-help and job-specific training. And he seemed to accept or condone segregation. As long as African Americans were not denied access to good jobs, in a sense, a chance at self-improvement. So he was basically okay in the South if you wanted to have Black communities and white communities, if they were actually separate but equal. Right? They'll build their own colleges, they will build their own businesses, their own way of life. You guys have your own way. So they funded civil rights lawsuits. And it's a bit of two elements. It's like publicly, he argued African Americans should accept their various social position. This makes him a more controversial person today. He was invited to the White House by President Theodore Roosevelt. First African American guest asked to spend the night at the White House, and Theodore Roosevelt gets a lot of backlash for this. All right, W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, this man lives for a very long time. Like he lived from like Abraham Lincoln to President Kennedy. He was a scholar, activist, writer, and editor. He authored more than 20 books, and he was the first African American to earn a doctorate from Harvard. And he helped form the NAACP, which, this is their name, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was basically a joint effort between African Americans and Jewish Americans, who both faced different types of discrimination, working to a joint effort for equality. So, what's his approach? It's going to be different than Washington's approach. So Du Bois' approach, he believed that the talented 10th, the top 10% of African Americans in any field, should lead the charge for equality for African Americans. And he helped launch the NAGA movement, which called for the immediate end of segregation and Jim Crow electoral laws. So his stance is for them to put their best people forward. They're most qualified to lead the charge. All right, then we have Marcus Garvey. He founded the United Negro Improvement Association, which stressed the need for African American owned businesses and social institutions. And he established a number of large-scale business ventures. Now, Garvey's view was that true reconciliation with white Americans was impossible. And so he urged African Americans to build up their own communities and plan for a future that would be separate from the white world. So in this spectrum, you can get some weird things where you have people who are white supremacists who believe African Americans are inferior. Therefore, that's why there should be segregation. That's why there should be the separation. But some of their ideals actually align with someone like Marcus Garvey, who is a black separatist, who believes that African Americans are equal or better than whites. And that's why it's okay for them to live separately in society. Do you think? There are things. That's his idea. And so their reasons are very different from one another. But it sometimes ends up in the same spot.